Hello today. Hello, my relatives. I'm so happy to be here with you and join you with a good heart. I am actually really thrilled to be up here. I had a beautiful drive up from the Twin Cities, and it hardly felt like it was 4.5 hours or 4 hours, but I sure enjoy and appreciate this opportunity to share the work that we've been doing in Minnesota around this, and I call it a pandemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And we know that it's not just the women, it's the girls, it's boys, it's our two-spirit people. And this has been a historic pandemic since the moment that Europeans stepped onto this continent. And it's not just this continent, it's worldwide. Women of color, communities of color are generally and always the prey of those that have stronger weapons, have a more advanced culture, and are the dominant ones. And so I'm very, very pleased to be here and share with you the task force around the missing and murdered Indigenous women. I'm presenting this to you. I know it's got January 28th, but I wanted to use this slide because I have to always remember to give credit to some of the people that worked really, really hard on this project. Nicole Matthews at the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition was my co-chair. I was the chair of the task force as well as the author of the legislation. Nigel Perot worked with us. He is now with the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, but he was formerly with the Department of Public Safety. And then Nicole Martin Rogers from Wilder Research. She was absolutely instrumental in putting together the report, getting it organized, collecting the data, synthesizing the data, and then putting the report together. And you can access that online. But I wanted to make sure that we had this out there, and Wilder Research really was a partner in this work. Not sure I'm hitting the right.
Sometimes it gets messed up.
Okay. Well, I'll just give you a little bit of information about myself. I was born in St. Paul. Both my parents were born and raised in North St. Paul. And when I was just a baby, my dad moved us up to Sartell, Minnesota. And that's where I grew up on the Mississippi River and where the Watab Creek and the Mississippi River meet. I am number 9 of 13 children, and I have a twin brother and 2 older twin brothers. So I like to say I have 3 twin brothers. I'm one of 3 twin brothers. I have been a teacher for the past 25 years. I was a library media specialist in the Twin Cities. And I think that those years have really grounded me to the work that I've done in the legislature, especially around issues in education and our Native American folks. My grandfather was born in Elbowwood, South Dakota. He was a rural tribal member of the Standing Rock tribe, as was my mother. And due to the federal regulations or the tribal regulations around quantum, my generation does not have the opportunity to be enrolled, though someday we hope to be enrolled. But that didn't mean that we didn't recognize and celebrate our Native roots that came through my grandfather. And so that is another part of the puzzle with the legislation that I do when it comes to our Indigenous people. I was elected to the House of Representatives about in 2016. Oops, that goes back, that goes forward. I was elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives in 2016. And I represented District 41B, which was where the communities of St. Anthony Village, New Brighton, Columbia Heights, and Hilltop. 4 years later, I was elected to the Senate seat, and I now added Columbia Heights and a little bit of Spring Lake Park to my my constituency. I mentioned I'm an educator of 25 years, and my district, I have 3 children, 3 adult children, and I just became a grandma about a week ago. Yeah, I'm so excited. And you know, a lot of the work that I do, people say, why do you do this? Or who are you doing this work for? I was raised to understand that you always leave the area you've been in better than you found it, whether it's your bedroom or your community or the environment, or as I say, our investment in the future, and making sure that we haven't put in place good investments for the next 7 generations plus. And so that's what really, really guides me. I'm also the author of the legislation for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Taskforce and the office of the permanent office of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office in our state government. Those are 2 feats that, to tell you the truth, I'm still a little gobsmacked that we were able to do it in the short time that we did, given that we have such a division in our state legislature. But what really prompted me to do the work around the missing and murdered Indigenous women was the summer after I had my first session down at the state legislature. I had been listening to the preliminary report from Canada that came out of Canada on their missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. And it was heartbreaking, it was horrifying, and it just made me feel like I needed to do something, we needed to do something. It was the same summer that there was a tragic murder in North Dakota. There was a young woman who was tricked to go up to her neighbor's house. She was an Indigenous woman, and she went to visit her neighbor. They kept her there. She was missing. Nobody heard about it. We didn't hear about it in the media, but within our community, our Native community, we heard about it. Her name is Savannah Grewin Lafontaine. And a beautiful young woman, 8 months pregnant, went to visit her neighbors and was not seen again. They found her body in the river. The baby had been cut from her womb, and they had no idea what happened to that child. And as it turned out, the neighbors that she had gone to visit had planned all along through her pregnancy to take her baby. And it wasn't until the sensationalism of that story hit that the media started to pay attention to the whole tragedy of the situation. And that seems to be the story over and over in this pandemic of our missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so I had this thought, you know, like, Canada is doing this national study on missing and murdered. Why isn't the United States? North Dakota is starting to pass legislation or look at legislation to address it. Why isn't Minnesota? And then I had that epiphany, like, I'm a state legislator. That's what I'm supposed to do. And as a new legislator, I really did not have any idea how to approach this, but I went back into my office that summer and started working with research. I reached out to our Native community and asked a lot of questions. And my first question was, should we do this? Should we create a task force to address this issue? Because it is so historically traumatic to almost every family, every Native family in this state and across this nation. And I didn't want to do something that was going to re-traumatize or create an issue within our community unless we had the permission. And the word came back, yes, we absolutely have to do this. We have to tell the story. People have to know that this has been happening, is happening, and we want to end it. And so with that, I asked the community of women, Native women, to help me craft that legislation. So we started out with a rough draft of a bill, and they went through it fine comb, and they were the ones that asked the good questions. They were the ones that decided who should be on that task force. And then with their support, we dropped that bill. It didn't pass the first year, so we had testimony. This young woman right here that's on this picture, Misty Babineau. Misty's a Native American woman here in Minnesota. She suffered unbelievable tragedy and violence in her young life, and as a young woman was kidnapped and raped and beaten and left for dead. And she was able to get to safety and testified every single time we had a committee hearing. Every time there was the story to be told, Misty showed up and told her story. And there was never a dry eye in the room. If she was here to tell her story, you would be sobbing at the end of it. And every time I hear it, it breaks my heart even more. But that's the kind of courage, that's the kind of support that we had from our Native community to pass this legislation. So what is the injustice of the missing and murdered Indigenous women? Here in Minnesota, these are some of the facts that we have in our report that we came up with. Even though our American Indian women and girls make up just 1% of our state population, from 2010 through 2018, 8% of all murdered women and girls in Minnesota were American Indian. And that's not just urban, but statewide. Between the months, any given month from 2012 to 2020, between 27 and 54 American Indian women and girls in Minnesota went missing in any given month. We don't hear about that, do we? It's not in the media. It's not one of our statistics that are there, but it's happening. And we have to do something about it. It's just like we were speaking earlier. So many people don't know about this pandemic. So many people don't know about the generational historic violence against our Native communities. And I can give you a break if you don't know, but once you know, then it is your responsibility to join us all in addressing this issue and making sure that this kind of offense against any community member comes to an end. So another thing that really surprised me as I was trying to pass this legislation or any other legislation that affects our Native communities is the fact that maybe 5% of the people in Minnesota know how many tribes there are in Minnesota. They absolutely do not know this. We might have it in our social studies book for Minnesota. We might talk about the different tribes, but the bottom line is, and at the legislature, people did not know this. Legislators did not know this. Legislators who represent Indian country in Minnesota did not know this. So there's a terrible, terrible miss in our knowledge around our Indigenous people here in Minnesota. This is a map, and this has all of our different tribes that you can see in the northern Minnesota, Mille Lacs, and then down into southern Minnesota. We've divided or separated out a very unique characteristic of our tribes. There is this thing called Public Law 280. And Public Law 280 is a contributor to the confusion when it comes to jurisdiction to address these atrocities. And this is a level of who's in charge of investigating a murder or a missing person or anything that happens on tribal land. Public Law 280 withdrew federal criminal jurisdictions that reservations have in, I think there are 8 states that carry Public Law 280. So here in Minnesota, these these reservations on the left are covered under Public Law 280. Red Lake and Bois Forte are exempt from Public Law 280. When the federal government came and said, well, you know, you have this opportunity to have us help you with your policing, Red Lake and Bois Forte said, no, thank you. We're going to do it ourselves. We don't need your help. We don't want your interference. We will do it. And so what happens too often when there are issues or offenses on tribal land on these reservations on the left is that there's a little confusion. Is the tribal police responsible for it? Is the county police, or the federal government, the state government? And so it's unclear oftentimes. If you are on Indian land and you rape and kill somebody, they can walk off of the reservation and get away with it because of Public Law 280 and the lack of resources on our tribes. And so this adds to that whole confusion when it comes to addressing the issue and who's responsible for investigating. Too often it just doesn't happen, or it's just a minimal attempt. So one of the issues that we also knew and also uncovered more information is around sex trafficking here in Minnesota. And I don't know, what you know or what you've heard over the years around sex trafficking. Duluth was a huge hub for many, many, many years, especially for Native girls. It was easy to sort of seduce them with money and goods and promise of a good life, get them onto a ship, the ship leaves, and many of those girls were never seen again. It's a direct pipeline out into a worldwide sex trafficking opportunity for others. Sometimes those women came back and told those stories. Oftentimes for many women, it was a form of survival because they felt they had no other opportunity to raise money or support their families. And so this is a quote from one of our key informants. One of the really great things about having the task force was that we went out into the communities and had listening sessions. Of course, that came to an abrupt halt with the COVID pandemic, but we were able to continue to either hold Zoom meetings. We made sure that there was a phone line that was dedicated to folks who wanted to call and leave information or tell their story. They were able to email us. We made sure that there was every opportunity for them to, for our Indigenous communities, our Native folks, to tell the stories that they knew happened. And so this is a quote from one of those key informants. It says, "I think we have to understand the current day sex trade and exploitation of American Indian, Native women and girls in context of a long historical span of settler colonialism and genocide. And understanding those historic patterns are still with us today." And that is, we found that to be true. That statement was continued to be true. The historic genocide and the effect of colonization on our tribes are still affecting our tribes to this day. So we were able to collect some data. And again, one of our biggest problems was the ability to collect data and data that we could sift down to make it understandable. What has happened over the years is that either there hasn't been any record or information or data kept on missing and murdered Indigenous people, or it's been done haphazardly, or it's collected differently in different agencies, in different commissions, in different police stations, in different communities. And so nobody was collecting the same information in the same way and documenting it in the same manner. And that made it very, very difficult. And that is a problem that we have found across the nation. When I first introduced the piece of legislation, I went to, I'm a Democrat, a DFLer. I went to my Republican counterparts and asked them to support this bill, and they had a lot of good questions. And one of the questions is, where is this happening? Why is it happening? Is there a cycle? What's the pattern here? And we didn't have a pattern to give them because of the lack of information or the lack of statistics on this. But we were able, once we started that task force, because we had buy-in not just from the state legislature, and I should tell you, when we passed the task force, we had 100% support from every member in the House, DFL and Republican, and the support of every Senate member as well. It was 100%. I know, I get goosebumps every time I say that. Unreal. I mean, tell me, I almost fell over. But the thing is that opened the door and allowed commissioners and agencies to start sharing some of the data that they did have. And when I was putting this together, not only did I go to the Native community, but I went to those agencies and commissioners and said, I have this piece of legislation. I know it's a tough sell, but I want to know if you have information on it, number one, and number two, would you be willing to participate in the task force? Every single one of them said absolutely. And every single one of them said, yes, we know this is going on. They just hadn't gotten coordinated in a way that they could address this. And so because of that and the willingness across the board, we were able to start collecting some of the information and data. And one of the things that we found out that in 2017, the law enforcement agencies reported 173 sex trafficking incidences in 2017, and 20% of those victims were American Indian. And so that was an unfortunate confirmation. I mean, I would have loved it if we could start looking at the information and the data and find that this really wasn't the case. But we knew anecdotally, we knew from the Native community that this was continuing to happen. There's hardly a family that didn't have a great grandma or grandma or auntie or sister or cousin or best friend or somebody that has been exploited in some way, that has gone missing or murdered. And so we knew this, but we needed to confirm it for our state legislatures, and we did. So we created this task force, and a lot of these things are just what the Native community told us we should have in this task force. We set out to examine the systemic causes behind violence that Indigenous women and girls experience. We wanted to examine appropriate methods for tracking and collecting data. Data drives action, not just at the state level, not just at the county level, not just at the municipal level, but it drives data in the medical field, in the coroner's office, in policing, all of those things. And then we wanted to make sure that we would report the policies and the different institutions that we already have in place, like policing, our child welfare, the coroner's office, and other governmental practices that are going to impact the violence on our Native women and girls, and those investigation and prosecution of crimes. It is absolutely vitally important, I feel, that we share this information and we share it annually as best we can. You know, if there's a day that comes when we say there's no more information to share, nothing new here, you know, we don't have any new data, you know, we're done, that is the day that we are looking for. So it's absolutely important that we are reporting on what we are finding, but also the changes that need to be done within these different agencies and how they're addressing it. The very last task force meeting that we had in November, I believe, I asked some of those agency leads and commissioners, I said, even though we haven't put in place legislation insisting or making you make some changes within your scope of authority, have you done anything differently voluntarily? Have you, you know, thought to look into your agency, your practices, the people that you have in place, and made any positive changes? Every single one of them said yes. So not always do we have to legislate and order people to make change, but there's good people that are going to recognize it now and look at how they can make those internal changes voluntarily and not through legislation. And that was extremely rewarding and heartwarming for me. Again, we are going to, we insisted on reporting on those measures necessary to address. So we in December, we completed that report on the missing and murdered, and we reported it to the state legislature with a number of suggestions or mandates or recommendations, because it's absolutely important that we continue to go back to the legislature and educate them on this. The fact that everybody at the legislature now knows what MMIW means is huge. And we're going to continue to educate them on these issues and so many other that affect our communities, and not just our Native communities, but our communities at whole when it comes to violence and lack of resource within our communities. And then we absolutely, and this was one of the most important things that the community said, we want to look for ways to help those victims, to help those families and the victims' communities prevent this kind of violence, but also heal from the violence. This historic trauma has basically been handed down, inherited from child to child to child through these generations, not just the violence against our Indigenous communities, but things like relocation, the Relocation Act, boarding schools. You're hearing all about the boarding schools these days and the effects of how that destroyed the nuclear family in our Native communities. Those are all things that not only are handed down through emotional disconnection, or the fact that a lot of those children came home or never came home from boarding school and did not know who their families were, had a long time lasting effect. And it certainly has an effect on the violence in our communities. We put together an incredible list of members for our task force. It was pretty large. We made sure that we had representatives from both sides of the aisle, both in the House and the Senate. We made sure that we had the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension on there, the Minnesota Sheriff's Association, the U.S. Attorney, Judicial Court, county attorneys, epidemiologists. We made sure that we had representation from all 11 tribes. And we wanted everybody's voice. We wanted everybody's input onto this, into this task force. We also, again, I was a chair, and Nicole Matthews was the co-chair. And so they really led the way as we address more and more of the issues that we were starting to uncover. So what did this task force do? We got to work right away. And what was so great is that even before we passed this task force, the legislation for it, there were people within the Indian community that were poised to begin the moment we passed it. And I'm not going to lie, the fact that I was able to pass this legislation in 2 years is still, as I said, astounding to me. I thought it would take a long, long, long time, but it didn't. And I remember going to a dinner one night within the Native community, and I was sitting at a table, and this young man was next to me, and we were going around introducing ourselves. And I said, I'm, State Representative Mary Kunesh. And after I gave my little spiel, he leaned over and he said, when you pass that legislation, I'm gonna be in the government running that task force. So he had already planned, he was already working within the Department of Public Safety on how to set this department up and how to make it successful. And that was Nigel Perot. So it was not a hard thing to put this together. I was really scared. I had no idea, again, how to put a task force together within the Minnesota State Legislature. But fortunately, Nigel and Kate Weeks at DPS and Nicole Martin Rogers at Wilder did, and they got us going right away because we had a lot of work to do. We had to do this report within 18 months, which is unbelievable. So we had in-person and virtual task force meetings that included expert presenters and public comment sessions. We had literature review of the research and articles about the MMIW injustice. And, you know, one of the things that when I first started to look at this legislation, you know, I went to the internet and I Googled MMIW, missing murdered women, blah, blah, blah. And I found some information on it, but not a whole lot, and definitely not data that I was going to be able to back up this legislation with. But the Urban Health Institute in Seattle had just begun, and they put out a report on it on MMIW. And that was like the nucleus of the information that I was able to share. And so it was important that we looked at whatever research was there, but also identify what was not there. Where was the data missing from? We found data across the nation where if a woman came into the coroner's office and she didn't have identification with her, and they would take a look at her physical characteristics and try to identify her race or who she was by those attempts. And we found in some places under Indian, they combined like Native American Indian and East India Indians under that. So how do you break that out? How do you even break that out? There was a state representative that was in the House when I arrived, Susan Allen. She's from the Twin Cities. Beautiful combination of a number of different tribes. When you look at her, you kind of look at her and you're like, where is she from? Or, you know, what is her affiliation? And she told me that so often people thought she was Hmong or Korean. She was, you know, she's got short in stature, straight, beautiful black hair, you know, almond eyes. But I said, Susan, if you went missing and they didn't know who you were, do you think they would identify you as an Asian woman? And she said, absolutely. People think I'm you know, Korean or Hmong. And so the misinformation, the miscollection of data was also something that we had to look very closely at. We also had interviews with 32 experts. And one of those experts was the director of the MMIW report in Canada. She gave us a lot of really good pointers. And one of the things that she told us is, once you finish this report, don't just put it on the shelf. She said, make sure you have action items to follow up after the report, and that you get going on those right away. Don't put any time in between. Don't put this report on the shelf, because it'll lose the momentum and it's hard to get people back into the swing of things. And so that was foremost in our minds when we created the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office. We also looked at the different items within our state data around the issue. We looked at child welfare. Native American children are removed from their families and put into foster care, often permanent foster care, than any other group of children in this state. Minnesota has the highest rates of Native American child removal in the nation, and it continues to this day. And it is a direct correlation to mental health issues, to early pregnancy, to violence against those young children, abuse, mental and physical and sexual abuse. It often will be represented in the high rates of incarceration within our Native communities as well. So that has a direct correlation to this violence against our women and children. We looked at deaths and human trafficking. We looked at missing persons and crimes in the BCA. And then we took a lot of time to deliberately brainstorm and then refine the mandates, the recommendations that we were going to put into the final report. And again, we went back into the community and asked them, what is it that you think we should do? For so long, our Native communities were told, we're doing this for you. Here's what we're doing for you. We're gonna help you do this. We're gonna make you better. We're gonna fix you. But we wanted to hear from them. And that's where those mandates come from. So some of the key findings within our report, of course, the root causes of this whole violence pandemic is colonization and the historic trauma against our Native communities. The relocation era, if you're not familiar with that, Google it and you'll learn so much about it. You know, the tribes were all sequestered onto reservations, and in a lot of reservations originally, Natives weren't even allowed to leave their reservation. If you've ever heard that term, off the res, meaning somebody's not where they're supposed to be, it's a derogatory term. It means it's a Native person that's off of the res when they're supposed to be, you know, sequestered onto the reservation. And so the government realized, oh, we promised them within the treaties that we would house them, we would feed them, we would educate them, we would provide health services, we would teach them how to have a vocation, how to work, to be self-sustaining. And the federal government has never, ever fully met their responsibilities in this way. And they realized it was costing a lot of money to keep all these Indians on the reservation, all those commodity food that they had to haul out there all the time, trying to create good good schools and have teachers and the resources there. None of that ever happened the way it should have. So then they're like, well, then let's get them off the reservation. And so they enticed them and said, come to the cities, we'll help you find a good job, we'll make sure you have a home, that your kids are in good schools, we'll help you get acclimated to urban life. And so a lot of Native folks left in droves, only to be, you know, have the rug pulled out from underneath them once again. There weren't good job trainings. There wasn't good housing for them. They were put in areas that were so different and so foreign, there was not a way to ease them into the community. And it was a dismal failure, which also adds to this confounding violence. We talked a little bit about the boarding schools. Minnesota had, 11 boarding schools here in Minnesota. The University of Minnesota Morris used to be a boarding school. And when the University of Minnesota took it over, bought it from whoever was running it, the agreement was that any Native person, whether enrolled or a descendant of a Native person, can come to this school tuition free. And so my family has taken advantage of that. My son actually graduated. I have a number of nieces and nephews. But the University of Morris was an Indian boarding school, and the kids would ride their horses from the Dakotas and around the state to that. They still have their stables there. They still have the horse stables there from when the kids would bring their horses in. And we know how devastating that was. My grandfather was not sent to a boarding school, but his brother was sent to a boarding school, Carlisle out in Pennsylvania. And my Uncle Collie ran away again and again and again. And Carlisle has taken all their records and digitalized them, and you can access them on the internet. And so we looked him up, and sure enough, his records were there. And there's a behavior card on my uncle, and it's got half a dozen dates. And behind those dates, it says running. So my uncle tried to run time after time after time, run home back to the Standing Rock Reservation from Pennsylvania. And it wasn't until the last time he fell off of a train, jumping trains, and had his leg cut off, that they let him go home. but they let him go home. There are thousands, tens of thousands of children that never got home. Imagine that emotional toll on the family, on the parents, on the siblings, on the community. Racism, we still see that today. We still see that today. I remember speaking to an elder that lives up here, up north, and she said when she was a young woman, or even, you know, to this day, they would do their best to fill up their gas tank up here and drive as far down as they could without stopping. Because if they stopped for gas or if they stopped for food, they were harassed in the most horrible, horrible way. They were refused in restaurants. They were assaulted in different ways. Their cars would be hijacked. Terrible names, terrible things were said to them. And so you know, those are the things that never leave your mind or your thoughts. Driving up here today, I was thinking about that. How long did it take them before they had to stop for gas to get down to the Twin Cities? And then sexism and sexual objectification of Indigenous women and girls. You know, if you Google Native American costume for Halloween, and you see all these pictures of this very sexualized, curvaceous, Pocahontas type costume that is available. It's still out there and it's still available. There was the whole scenario around the Native girl on the Land O'Lakes butter box. You know, very sexualized. If you look at it close enough, I mean, we grew up with it. We never, you know, a lot of people never even thought, but there are people that realize that was absolutely true. And then our sports mascots, you know, how hard we have to get to have people stop using the character images of Native Americans, or, you know, some of the disrespectful chants and verbiage that goes along with that. Those are all things that have direct influence on the society that we live in today, and the society that has allowed the violence against women and girls and Two-Spirit. So what did we find? We found that there are systemic risks all around. And we're not talking about, you know, one of the things that when we were interviewing people, not just individuals, but folks within the different systems within our state government, our mental health, our public safety, a lot of times we heard stories when family had somebody go missing and they'd report it to the police. And too often the police were rather dismissive or uncooperative, or just weren't interested or engaged in it. And oftentimes the victim was re-victimized. They were said, you know, it was suggested maybe she ran away with her boyfriend, or she's out partying, or, you know, she's not really missing, or that this is a person that probably deserved what she got, whatever happened, because of that kind of idea around our Native American communities. So those systemic risk factors increase the risk of violence and abuse for Indigenous women and girls, because when public safety doesn't take their loss or their murder seriously, it sends a message to the community that these women are not valued, that they're not worth our time. And there was a young woman who went missing. Her mother and sister reported her, and the police said, "We don't have time to go looking for Native girls. We've got better things to do." Absolutely was told that. Poverty and lack of housing, again, a direct correlation to the Relocation Act. Involvement in the child welfare system and criminal justice system. We talked about the effect of foster care and the high rates of removal. Being a victim of domestic violence. And, you know, too often women and our Two-Spirit folks are in such desperate straits that they find themselves an easy prey to predators and are brought into prostitution and trafficking. And those are just some of the things that have affected our communities, our Native communities, decade after decade, generation after generation. One statistic, one thing we found around domestic violence, when Native women did report domestic violence and the police came, we found that it was primarily not Native men that are doing the violence. It's men of other populations. So a lot of times people will assume, well, you know, those Native men, they're, you know, they like to drink, they all take drugs, they're this, they're that, you know, what do you expect? That's perfect. No, it's not the Native men that are the perpetrators. And that was really, really important for us to share and to highlight. Under seeking justice. So when Indigenous women or girls go missing or dies under suspicious circumstances, the investigation, the prosecution, and the sentencing process that are supposed to serve justice often fail to provide equal and fair treatment for these Indigenous victims. There was just a young woman that went missing. Gosh, her name,
Gabby.
Yeah, Gabby. Imagine if the country riled around every Native woman that went missing like that, where it was in social media, it was in the news, that they pulled all the resources from all those different states to find a Native woman. That happens time and time and time again. So a little bit deeper dive into sex trafficking. This is another statistic that we were able to find. At that same time in 2019, there were 401 incidences of sex trafficking that was identified. And there were 173 victims in those incidences. Of that 401, 182 arrests were made. So not even 50%. And of that 182, only 96 charges were filed against those traffickers. And only 32 convictions came out of 401 incidences. What does that tell you? Something's wrong here, right? Something doesn't smell right. So again, one of our key informants told us, unfortunately, I think for folks on reservations, there's a common understanding that these crimes won't be prosecuted. And so what happens is that too often, especially historically, families just stopped reporting it. They just hoped that their daughter would come home one day, or their loved one would show up, or somebody would tell them what happened. But they stopped reporting it when they didn't get any support or any effort to help locate their loved one. We found under prevention and healing that the system absolutely does not have adequate cultural responsive healing resources for our Indigenous victims, survivors, families, and communities. Historically, for a long time, our Native communities were not allowed. It was against the law to practice their religious or their cultural practices. You had to go deep into the woods, or hide when you were practicing any of your cultural practices, because you could get in big trouble. And so when we look at how we can address these issues, a lot of times there will be agencies or community resources for women to go to who are battered, victims of violence, a safe place for them. But it's a little bit different within our Native culture, the way we address those issues. And for so long, the white colonialism of our culture wouldn't allow for that. It's like, no, you do it our way. We're going to fix you our way. We'll only pay if you do it our way. And so we must be more sensitive to the way that our Native people know the best healing system is to be. I know a number of Native folks. In fact, I have a couple of brothers that have had issues with addiction and went through a number of different processes to kick their habit and go through rehabilitation. It was not until they went through a Native system, a Native rehab program with the elders there, where they could sweat, where they could smudge, where they could, really commune with those that they felt that connection with, that they were able to kick their habits. And so when we look at, the foster care system, the emotional, social health of our Native communities, within those systems, if we wanted to send somebody or allow somebody to go to a culturally responsive program, medical insurance wouldn't pay for it. Mental health costs wouldn't cover it. And we have to change that around, absolutely. And it's not just for our Native communities. Our Somali, our Hmong, we know best how to heal our people, and we need to make sure that is supported. So I'm just going to take a minute to talk a little bit about the extractive industry and the effect on the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And there will be those people that will poo-poo this, but it has been shown time and time again that extractive industry brings large number of men with time on their hands, money in their pockets, and it is the communities that surround them. And too often within the extractive world, it's Native Americans and reservations. Because remember, they kicked all the natives out onto these reservations in the middle of nowhere on desolate land. And lo and behold, what do they find? Underneath that land, there are minerals and there are things that we want to get at. And so, we saw what happened with DAPL. We've seen it time and time again, that the rise in violence, especially around Native women and women of color, rises, domestic violence rises when there are these extractive industries that come in and have what they call man camps, or large numbers of men that are there. One of the things that another public comment was, there's a natural association that happens wherever there is a lot of extractive industries. Wherever there are oil wells or uranium mines, the violence towards Native women increases exponentially and in direct relationship. Something needs to be challenged in looking at American society. We need to challenge the normalization. We have the whole Line 3 epidemic or situation here in Minnesota. And one of the things that happened when the permits were being discussed and there were hearings around that, women, Native women from all over the state came to testify and to educate and inform those people that are making the decisions around the rise in violence around the extractive industry. Those women sat up on the hearing table, and there were men in the audience that heckled them, that laughed at them, that dismissed them, that treated them so poorly, and nobody stopped it. And we told them this was going to happen, and it did. In February and in June, the Minnesota Sex Trafficking Taskforce conducted a sex sting here in northern Minnesota. And in both of those things, there were 7 men charged and 6 men charged in the second one. And there were Enbridge employees in that sting that were caught. So we know, again, that this absolutely happens. And why any community would allow that to happen within the sphere of their control, I do not understand. So what did we finally do? What did we come up with in our report? We had like 20 more, or even more than that mandates, but we sifted it down. The first thing we wanted to do was create a missing and murdered Indigenous women office to provide ongoing attention and leadership for this issue. We can check that one off because this past legislative session, I carried legislation along with Representative Heather Keeler over in Fargo, Moorhead, and we created a Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office. It's a permanent office. It has 4 staff members, and they will continue to do the work that we started here, because we want to make sure that we are addressing the systemic racism and that we are focusing on eliminating poverty and meeting the basic needs of the communities that are most vulnerable. We were able to ensure permanent funding and resources to create this office within our state government and to have at least 4 employees there to do the work. We also are determined to produce an annual MMIW report and a public dashboard where people can go and continue to read up on it and educate themselves, and where we can deposit the data that we collect. We also want to make sure that there is state and federal technical assistance to support tribes, and so that they have access and can participate in all the relevant data systems. We want to have that system available so that tribes can share with their local government, with their state government, with the county government, with nationally, so that we can know what's actually happening. There has to be legislation too often to allow for data sharing. And that is just a real, I understand it, you know, data confidentially is important, but we want to make sure that there's that opportunity to share that information. We also want to make sure that there are supports for our tribes to exercise their sovereignty and increase their jurisdictional authority so that they can investigate and prosecute and sentence perpetrators of violence against our Native women and girls. We also, if there's one thing that you can do after today, is to contact our federal representatives and absolutely demand that we pass the 2020 Violence Against Women Act, VAWA Act. These are extra protections for our tribal women and children, but also violence against women in general. Absolutely, it has to be renewed. And this is one of the things that I get really tired of. Something as important as these important controls for support and resources for violence against women resources, we have to go back and renew them. They don't make them permanent. So every 4 years, we have to go back and vote to renew it. And it just doesn't make any sense to me. Let's make it permanent so we don't have to go back and ask for basic supports. We want to expand Minnesota safe harbor laws. We want to increase personnel and resources. We want to provide more training and resources, especially in Indian country and greater Minnesota, to conduct effective investigations of MMIW related cases. You know, these things happen. And if you don't have people that understand how to address it, how to handle it, how to speak to the victims families, how to gather information, it's not going to happen. And so, you know, I'm an educator. Let's continue to educate everybody. We want to make sure that any of the MMIW related deaths receive an autopsy and are investigated by a coroner. So often we found that if there's a death certificate or a body is found, a victim is found, because they haven't taken enough time to really investigate, it's often listed as a suicide. When families know darn well, my daughter was not suicidal. There was no reason my daughter would have taken her own life. And it's just easier to say suicide and close the door on it. And that has happened too many times. We want to make sure that we're strengthening trauma-informed and victim-centered responses to law enforcement, courts, and the healthcare system. And we want to, again, address the harm that the child welfare system has had on our Native communities. These are all mandates that we put into our report. Again, we want to talk about how we can educate our communities, and we want to make sure that there is age-appropriate, culturally responsive, trauma-informed education on healthy relationships and consent to all students in Minnesota's K through 12 schools. I carried a bill that would allow this to happen, to talk about consent within our health classes within our school system. And we had broad pushback from our Republicans. One legislator said to me, "Oh yeah, you're going to teach those kids to start having sex in kindergarten?" I said, "No, why would we do that? You know, we teach them about their personal space, right? When somebody says no, it means no, whether it's don't push me on the swing, or don't keep hitting me, or don't copy my homework. When somebody says no, no matter what it is, it means no. It doesn't mean maybe, or you're just being coy and we really mean yes. It means no. A kindergartner can understand that. And we need to start in kindergarten with those. We also want to increase the awareness around this issue. So thank you very much for holding this here. Prevent and reduce the harms of trafficking and sex exploitation and the normalization of violence against our Native women. And we would like to also require sex training, awareness training, and targeted prevention to Indian country, especially where there are extractive industries like oil and mining camps, casinos, and hotels. Those are two other big areas where we find people are often carried away or exploited. And it's not only that, you know, we find that there are higher incidences and that young women are shipped in when it's hunting season, when there's big sporting events. I mean, you should have seen the Twin Cities when we had the Super Bowl. There was so much anti-sex trafficking, boots on the ground people there. It was unbelievable. It was a beautiful thing, but it was unbelievable because that's what happens everywhere you go. So it's not, it's a lot of different opportunities. And then we're going to make sure that any of those initiatives and decisions are done by and informed by Indigenous women and girls and those communities, especially those who are victims of it, because they understand more than anybody else does. And then we want to find ways to heal our communities, to heal our families, to make sure that those that have been victims or the families that are still looking for their loved one have resources available to have healthy, happy lives once again. So the next step is to form that MMI office, which we did. Senate File 1989 and House File 1030 did just that. We will continue to advocate at the legislature for each one of those mandates. We will advocate for our state agencies. We're going to continue research and continue case reviews. We are also going to look at sentencing guidelines when it comes to violence against women, children, men, boys, and two-spirits, and continue to coordinate with other agencies. One thing that we didn't have in the task force mandate or suggestion was a pool of funds that we could use as reward for sharing information. We found one thing is that there in communities, there's usually a few people that have a little bit of, know something about what happened, but either they're afraid or they haven't connected the dots or they were implicit in it. And so about a month ago, I was contacted by somebody that said, I have an opportunity to create a reward pool of money, but I don't know how to do it, specifically for MMIW. How can we do that? And so I'm working on legislation right now in order to create a reward pool of money that it's not all funded by the state government. Other agencies or other groups, individuals can put money in there to participate in that way. I don't have that legislation. I don't have a bill number for that, but we're working on it. So the best ideas, the best suggestions, the most informed information that we received has come from community. And I'm so very thankful for that. So what can you do? You can learn about what sex trafficking looks like, be aware of your surroundings and offer help if somebody needs it. Keep track of Amber Alerts and learn about the missing Indigenous women and girls Two-Spirit in your community. Advocate locally to ensure your county sheriff and municipal law enforcement, schools, local hospitals, etc., are aware of the MMIW injustice and the role of systems in preventing it. So after this, you can, start talking to your neighbors, start talking to your children that work in different areas within the communities, the different community members. Start informing them as well. And you can also, again, contact your representative about relevant legislation, including VAWA at the federal level, Safe Harbor at the state level. That's like, if you know something, you can tell it safely and not be implicit in the act. And ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act. That is those are federal laws that are supposed to protect our Native kids from being removed at those high numbers. And unfortunately, it doesn't happen. People at the level, mostly at the county level, child protection, don't understand ICWA law and are not following it to the letter of the law. Help any individuals or families that are involved in or trying to escape trafficking or domestic violence. One thing that has come up is this Your Call Minnesota. You can, again, Google yourcallminnesota.mn, and there are videos that will inform you and educate you around sex trafficking and violence against women. There are resources there, numbers and people that you can contact if you need to, or if you know somebody that is in a sticky situation. And then provide support for organizations that are doing the boots on the ground work, Mending the Sacred Heart Hoop up here in the northern Minnesota. ACO is in Duluth, American Indian Community Housing Organization, Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, and Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. These two are in the Twin Cities, and they provide a lot of help, not just to our urban Indian community, but the state as well. So there are resources out there that are available. We just have to make sure that we are supporting them to the best. So that's about all I have for you at this very moment in my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions or if you have any comments. Don't be shy to ask a question.
When I was a teacher, I said the only bad question is if I just explained it and then you the same thing. So there are no bad questions.
Yes.
I have a question on several slides back when you pointed out how many women are reported missing each month. Would that be some of the same people each month, or were those new people each month?
Those were new people. I think there might have been some repeats, let's just say. I don't know for sure, but those were new cases from what I understand.
Either way, it's awful.
Either way, it's awful.
That's even more awful.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you for that question.
How much cooperation are you getting from like the Minnesota DNR guys who are out in the field during deer season and that, looking for this kind of stuff?
I can't tell you like specifically the kind of
training that they've had, that the DNR have had, but I do know that statewide within the agencies and the commissioners, they are stepping up the training and the understanding about this happening. And just as I said, when I first started this this process, and I went to the commissioners and said, here's what I'm doing, here's what I want the outcome to look like, or I'm not even sure what the outcome would, but would you help us? Would you participate in it? And do you even know that this is happening? And they all said yes. They said yes, they knew that this is something that goes on, and yes, they were willing to participate in it. So to tell you the truth, I don't know, per department, what kind of participation other than like the sex trafficking task force. But that is one of the things that I'm hoping that our office will be able to do is work on individual agencies and then, pulling the information that they have so that we can start to address this. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. It's really good. We had the opportunity, I believe it was on Netflix, to watch the film Wind River. And I just wondered if you would comment about that film, whether you thought it was an accurate portrayal and whether it's worth watching for other people. I thought it was quite interesting.
So the gentleman mentioned a movie called Wind River. It takes place in a community of Native Americans with the extraction business nearby, and young girls had gone missing. And the investigator, the sheriff's daughter, had gone missing, and then a really good friend of it. It's pretty graphic. It's extremely emotional. I watched it on an airplane, and was just like, I had to just like cover my face. I was so affected by it and emotional about it. But it absolutely is an example, a really good example of explaining how this affects our Native community. And I would suggest every so often it shows up on Netflix. I know that. And I think you can find it in other ways to watch it. But it's called Wind River. It should have, it was up for an award, but the director was, oh my gosh, what was the director's name who got busted for all those sexual, Harvey Weinstein. He was the director of, I just about died when I found that out. So they wouldn't give they wouldn't give them the award because he was the director. That was awful. But please, if you have that opportunity, please watch that movie. It is, I'm going to tell you, it is very emotional, it's very graphic, but it's very clear about how this is happening again and again.
How do motel owners and staff find an opportunity for training? Is it offered through the Chamber of Commerce's? Can they let them know about it?
Yep, there are all kinds of training that is not just for our agencies and different folks, but the tourism business has been very, very supportive of training their employees. And I think through the Safe Harbor, there's legislation that provides for that training. I'm trying to think of a piece of legislation that was happening that I was asked to carry, where hotel managers were not able to kick people out of the motel if they thought that they were doing sex trafficking. And so we had to create legislation, or we are working on legislation that gives them that opportunity. But I know the airports, the hospitality industry are all doing training around this issue, especially sex trafficking. And that really started, I would say, really ramped up when we had the Super Bowl here. All of the hospitality industry really made a concerted effort. Once I was coming back I was flying somewhere, and I think it was in Florida or maybe Arizona. I was in the airport. This is pre-COVID. And I swear, every 7 minutes, there was an announcement. If you are being sex trafficked, if you know somebody who is being sex trafficked, if you are traveling under duress, please go to your nearest, desk. People are here to support you. And so those are the sort of things that I've picked up over time in the different areas of support within just not local communities, but, you know, in this industry of the world that we live in. I think there was oh.
Taylor Shears was director of Windrush.
Oh.
Jeremy Renner.
Okay.
It was a fabulous, great portrayal of Wyoming.
Yeah. Yeah. So my email is here, my office email is here. If you have any thoughts or questions or ideas or have ideas of how to support this effort, please don't hesitate to stop. I do a lot of work within our Native community on legislation. One of the things that we were able to do was get permanent funding for our 4 BIE, Bureau of Indian Education schools here in Minnesota. I was able to kind of dislink a couple of our tribal police from the county police. When a lot of the reservations started their policing agencies, the county or the state said, okay, you can have your own police department, but we're gonna make you partner with the county. And so the county sheriff is really in charge. They'll make sure that, you know, you're okay and you're doing what you're supposed to do. That causes a lot of trouble in some of the counties. Others, there's not a problem. So there have been opportunities for us to pass legislation to allow the autonomy of the individual reservation police agencies and just other things that are going to make this a better state and a better example for other states when it comes to allowing our Native communities to thrive in the best way that they know how to. So thank you very much.